Okay, welcome everyone to another Ask an Expert. We'll just give it another few seconds or so while people are populating and getting into our Zoom room here. Okay, and the numbers are climbing rapidly, which is pretty exciting. I'm really excited about today. Again, welcome. I'm Dr. Deirdre Pickerel. I am the Dean of Student Success for Yorkville University and Toronto Film School. And on behalf of the Student Success team, I am pleased to welcome you to today's Ask an Expert. We've been doing this every Friday since about mid-March. So for those of you that have been here for a while, you've heard my spiel. For those of you that are new, every Friday at this time, we welcome an expert from our community, somebody that we think is going to be really engaging and amazing to talk to and present to our Yorkville and TFS family. Our expert today will offer some brief thoughts on the topic, and then we will take questions. Using the Q&A panel at the bottom of your screen, you will find that I have recently learned how to disable the chat, so everybody's got to use the Q&A now. Expert should have always been on my radar. I've known her for a long time, and she's always done really incredible work. But for some reason, I don't know, Tina, what happened? I didn't think about you until I got this recent report from Brainstorm Strategy Group that said that only 4% of students surveyed would like to work for nonprofit or charitable organizations after they graduate. And I thought that number was pretty horrendously bad, given the amazing work that's available in nonprofit and charitable organizations. And the survey went on to report that 71% of students say it is very or extremely important that they feel like they are serving a cause or a greater good, which seems to me exactly the point of so many nonprofits and charities. And that seemed like a real huge disconnect and perhaps a lack of understanding of the amazing work that's available in the nonprofit sector and in charitable organizations. So we reached out to Tina Strelka, who's the CEO of Minerva BC, a Vancouver-based charity dedicated to advancing the leadership of women and girls. As CEO of Minerva BC, Tina leads a team of thoughtful, talented change makers who develop, empower, and promote women's leadership. Tina joined Minerva BC as the programs director in 2016 after 15 years developing her expertise in leadership, career development, and adult learning, HR, and communications, and assumed the role of CEO in October 2017. So congrats, 3 years, Tina. Tina has a BA in International Relations from UBC and MA in Communications from Rural Roads. She has lived and worked in Germany, Costa Rica, Ghana, and Taiwan, and her strengths are seeing the big picture, empathic thinking, and quick learning, and I know that she will be absolutely phenomenal. Tina, thank you so much for being here today. It's so good to see you. I'm going to mute myself and turn it over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Deirdre. It's so great to be here, and thank you so much for the invitation to speak. I know I've got some time to set a bit of context, give you a few thoughts, and then we'll move into a Q&A. Before we get started, I just did want to acknowledge that I am currently located on the unceded traditional territory of the Squamish, Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh people. I live in Vancouver and I work in Vancouver, and just wanted to acknowledge that I'm a guest on these territories. So as we jump in, I'm going to share a few slides. All right, so I titled my presentation, Love Your Mondays. So trying to really think about that desire for meaning and impact and to pursue a career that's meaningful to you, and then talking a bit about those opportunities that exist in charities and nonprofits. So today we're going to go a little bit about the sector. I'm going to tell you a little bit of high-level context setting for how we think about this sector, which is sometimes called the voluntary sector or the third sector or the social impact sector. I'm going to talk a bit about my experience, and then we'll open it up to questions. So let's get started with charities and nonprofits. So there are over 170,000 charities and nonprofits in Canada. Charities are regulated. So charities have a slightly different kind of a construct, and they are managed and regulated by the Canadian Revenue Agency, so the CRA, because when you donate to a charity, you are allowed to have a tax receipt. So charities have a different kind of obligation in terms of the impact that they have. So they are managed and regulated, so we know that there's about 85,000. Nonprofit organizations are not regulated in the same way. So the number of 170 is sort of a best guess because there may be many more nonprofits than are even aware, and there are nonprofits starting up each and every day. So it's a significant number of employers and organizations that make up this sector. The sector is accountable for 251 billion in total revenue, which is about 8% of our GDP. This is more than retail trade and close to the value of mining and oil and gas. So if we think about the size of the sector and the money that is generated through the activities of the sector, it is pretty significant. When you look at 8% GDP, the largest chunk of that comes from hospital and university foundations. So a big part of our charitable sector in Canada is actually supporting health research, health outcomes, as well as sort of that post-secondary university area, again, research, and sort of filling in gaps where those systems don't have those funds. But even if we take that out, there's still a good 2% of our GDP that's coming from all these other nonprofits, which are small and large, global and local, and quite a variety of types of employers that you will find in this industry. All told, about 2 million people are employed in the sector, but even more interesting, over 13 million people volunteer. So there's a big, big impact for people and connection to this sector. And it is an engine of our economy that is sort of sometimes forgotten because we aren't seen as one industry or one type of organization. We're doing work all over in all kinds of places. Funding for charities and nonprofits, Deirdre and I were just talking about this. The idea of nonprofit sort of suggests that there's no money, but there's actually a lot of money, and funding for organizations comes from individual and corporate donations, government grants, foundation grants, and even earned income from sale of goods, products, and hosting things like events. So there is a lot of money that happens within a nonprofit and a charitable sector. Money has to be raised, money has to be secured. So all the same kind of things you would find in business in terms of strategy and funding development, business development, marketing, communications, all of those functions still need to exist in a nonprofit and a charity because unlike any organization that's an entrepreneurial venture or a business venture, we are accountable for generating the revenue that drives their operations. And we use that revenue to have a social impact or a community impact versus generating profit. So that's the biggest difference from organizations that are charitable and nonprofits, is that we're using the revenue to drive back into a social good and a mission-based purpose versus a business purpose of solely generating profit. This is a sector that is ripe for disruption. So if I think about opportunities in the sector and the needs of the sector for really strong, talented people to come in and think differently, charities and nonprofits are hungry for the kind of things we've seen in the tech sector, the kind of things we've seen in disruption in traditional sectors. Nonprofits and charities are facing wicked problems. So if you know a bit about wicked problems, really complex systemic issues. I sort of joke that like the easy problems have been solved, and we are now really grappling with interconnected issues. We're grappling with societal issues that stem deeper than just sort of a band-aid solution or a patchwork solution. And so what you see in the sector is, how do we go at this from a systemic place? How do we partner? How do we go deeper? How do we look at the systems change and not just providing sort of superficial solutions that aren't getting at the root of the problem? So it's very interesting work because you're grappling with, sort of on the surface, what you see as the problem, and then trying to dig layers down into, well, what's the root of that and how is that connected to potentially other issues? So if you think about poverty, if you think about equality, if you think about some of the health issues, a lot of that can stem into bigger broad-based systemic change. So it's quite interesting and it's quite engaging to try and be in the sector and affect change. Ripe for disruption in the sense that it is known as a low-tech sector. So there will be differences across the board in sizes of organizations and different types of organizations, but generally speaking, the charitable and nonprofit sector hasn't had the ability to necessarily invest in infrastructure or technology or administration in the same way that other businesses might. So there's a lot of opportunity here to disrupt the way of doing things. And you can start to see that entrepreneurs are building donor databases or alternative methods of giving where it's maybe community-based or crowdfunding. So there's these new models that are coming through that are starting to influence the sector. And it's based on changes in giving practices and trends and sort of just changes in our world. But we're really a sector that is ripe for a lot of innovation and ideas. There's also a rise of social enterprise and social impact. So beyond charities and nonprofits, we are seeing an emergence of a sector called the social sector, the social impact sector, which may also include businesses. So for-profit, profit-generating businesses, but they want to use those profits to reinvest back into communities. So you see this sometimes in certain restaurants and cafes that maybe hire people who are marginalized and underrepresented in employment. You see different kind of models where businesses are also trying to do business for good. So there's sort of this interesting thing emerging where nonprofits are also looking to, well, what can we learn from business? Business is looking to, well, how can we be more like nonprofits or charities? And there's this emergence of this very cool sector that's trying to have a bigger impact and sort of a bottom line impact that goes beyond revenue and shareholders, but looking at social impact, looking at environmental impact. So it's a really neat time to be in the sector because there's this convergence of things happening. And then finally, some of the needs and opportunities that I see for really great diverse talent is the need to advance equity, diversity, and inclusion in this sector. So specifically at a leadership and a board level, the nonprofit sector is a sector that has always been welcoming to women, to racialized minorities, to Indigenous people, and to other marginalized groups in employment. But those folks tend to be overrepresented in front lines, and we still see some traditional positions being held sort of in leadership and on board levels that might not be as representative of our communities as we want. So really seeking the opportunity to influence and shake up our sector. And really the charitable nonprofit sector is pretty progressive when we think about, well, we need to do this, how do we do this? And just needs that support of how do we get there? So needing a lot of talent to move it along. In terms of my career experience, if I think about, meaningful careers and how do you find meaning in your career, I did not set out to start work in nonprofit. That wasn't my goal. I didn't leave university thinking that. And in fact, Minerva is my first nonprofit. I worked for other organizations that were for-profit, but did work in a charitable or nonprofit context by doing government contracts. So I've had different experiences in the sector, but what drove me to it was really wanting to make use of my interests and strengths. So the interests and skills that I learned both at university and that I developed early in my career. So those were things like I studied international relations. So I really like politics. I really like political science. So being in the areas that I'm in gives me an opportunity to follow government policy, to look at what kind of mandates and priorities government is setting and how that steeps into funding. How do we go after that funding to be able to affect change and run programs, whether that's employment or for young women in leadership, communications, leadership, and HR. Those are all interests and strengths that I developed in my career that I've found ways to use in my current job. So I really feel like I'm able to bring my strengths and sort of have my A game in play in my career because of working in the nonprofit sector. There's lots of opportunity that I found. So I always worked for small and medium-sized organizations, and what that afforded me was the opportunity to stick my fingers in a lot of pots and really get experience in areas that normally in a more hierarchical, larger organization I wouldn't get. So the nimbleness of a small organization, sometimes the nature of being project-based, so securing funding for a project that might last a year or 2 years, starting something up, wrapping it down, writing a proposal, getting something else, gave me a lot of exposure and a lot of experience to leadership, project management, creation, innovation, design, and human development. So there were lots of opportunities for me to try things, even if it wasn't a formal role change or a title or a position. I gained a lot of in-depth work experience by working for smaller organizations in this sector. Values. So we talk about meaning, we talk about connection, we talk about having an impact in the world. A lot of that is driven by what you value and the ability to drive your values through your career. So really understanding what's important to you and what's core to who you are as a person will help you to find meaning and satisfaction in your career because you can align those things. So for me, a huge value that I hold is learning and growth. So for myself, but also for others. And I always sought that in my career for myself, but also to be able to affect that kind of a change. So learning drives a lot of who I am and what I care about. And so all of my jobs, I've put myself in organizations that were focused on human development, that were focused on change through people learning, through people growing. So I was able to do that. Other values that I hold are around transparency and communication. So again, being able to move into a leadership role and have influence, and also work in a sector that has sort of a community perspective. So not just a bottom line revenue perspective, but a community perspective, and health and wellness of a community really aligns with who I am and what I care about. So my values have been met through the sector. And then finally, I think needs. So we talk about the other part of meaning and having a meaningful career is ensuring your needs are met. And that's partially compensation, but it's also flexibility and autonomy and lifestyle. And when I think about the nonprofit sector, I'm a mom, I've got 2 girls. The jobs that I've had, the relationships that I built, the way that the work was structured always allowed me flexibility to manage my schedule. It allowed me to work part-time when my kids were really young and find a blend and a balance at work. And I've also always found opportunity for compensation, leadership roles, and progressing my career and moving my career so that those needs are met as well. I think there's a perception that all nonprofit is low paid, and it's not true. There's absolutely nonprofit, smaller organizations that don't have means and don't have, but the sector is very diverse, and there are very large nonprofits that pay very well and have executive positions that are akin to CEOs of large organizations because they have tens of millions of dollars in revenue and endowment. So if you're thinking about compensation, don't wipe out the whole sector. It's an important part of what we want to think about in career development. It's not the only part, but it is an important part. But doing your research and finding out how organizations work, mostly in the nonprofit sector, you've got annual reports and data that you can find, so you get a pretty good idea of how those needs will be met. And beyond that, I think it's a sector that has made up sometimes for lower compensation or not as many benefits by allowing the freedoms and flexibilities to be able to organize work in a way that makes sense for individuals working in the sector. So I'm going to stop here and open it up to questions. I've given a bit of context about what I know about the sector, what I've found myself, and then I'd love to hear what you're curious about, wondering about, and how I can help.
Oh, Tina, thanks so much. I will admit that I'm completely shocked by the stat of 8% of our GDP. I had no idea. So this makes this session so much more important because it's huge. The opportunities are endless. And the other thing that struck me really is if I think about the programs that Yorkville University offers, or even Toronto Film School, there probably isn't really a program that we offer that doesn't have employment opportunities in the nonprofit or charitable sector. And so if students are not considering those as really viable places to work or to build their business or build their brand, they're missing out on incredible opportunities. So thank you so much. So we do have questions. So the first one I'm going to ask is, so I thought this was really important. Thank you for including pictures for people who belong to different racial backgrounds in your presentation. That's something that has come through as a real appreciation. And so thank you for that. So the question is, what are the most valuable lessons you have learned through working in nonprofits?
Oh, great question. I think saying yes to opportunities and taking risks. So I think, again, nonprofit may not be seen as sort of the sexy taking risks type entrepreneurial. I have found it to be a very entrepreneurial environment that does require risk taking, whether that's going for a proposal that's a little bit bigger than you think you can handle and figuring out how to staff up once you win it. Yeah, I think in my career, what always served me well was saying yes to an opportunity. And I'll give you an example. Early in my career, I worked for an organization that did career development work. That's how I met Deirdre. And in my first 6 months there, the organization didn't have a tech department, didn't have a tech, consultant or expert on staff. We didn't have that. So the president of the organization is like, we're going to start a tech team and we're going to figure out, we'll have this internal team to be our computer support. I'm not a techie. I'm not it's not really my thing, but I got approached and said, do you want to be the tech rep for this office that you're part of? And I was a new employee and I'm like, sure, why not? And so I got to learn about hardware and software and how to, initially troubleshoot sort of basics on a computer. And it was things like that of just saying yes to, I'm not really interested in that. It's not really going to drive my career forward, but why not? I'll gain a bit of skill. And what that actually gave me was a step up in being seen as a leader in the organization for saying yes to the opportunity and then being a point person for the rest of the team. So sometimes your opportunities to grow your career come in strange ways. So I think the biggest lesson is say yes and take risks.
Yeah, that's great. So the next question is a nonprofit a feasible career move for someone switching careers? So is experience or educational move more valued in like a new employee? So this sounds like somebody that's going through a bit of a career change and wondering whether the nonprofit sector might be more accepting of our mid-career career changers.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people come into the nonprofit sector in different ways, and certainly I see a move from individuals who feel a dissatisfaction maybe in one career path, and because of that cause of wanting to see meaning. The nonprofit sector, like any sector, is looking for talent and the right talent and the skilled talent. I think it is a sector that values diverse experiences, different backgrounds. I think in some ways, depending on the nonprofit, it can be a little bit more advanced than the corporate setting that maybe says you must have this degree, whereas in the nonprofit sector, it may be experience and background and the story of transition matter more. But I mean, I think it's viable at any stage. I think making the right decision of why nonprofit and which nonprofit and what aspect of the nonprofit world you want to be in and how your skills really align with that sounds like it would be good for you and for the organization.
Great, good, thanks. So, not a surprise, people want to know, how do they get started? um, are there any, is there any kind of secret nonprofit job site or a place that are more likely to, more likely to hire recent graduates? Like, how do people get started working in a nonprofit?
Yeah, so lots of ways. I think nonprofits are always looking for talent, and one of the best websites that is national is called Charity Village. There's job postings there that are both paid and unpaid, mostly paid, but there are unpaid opportunities. I think as you're starting out and trying to gain experience, looking for opportunities like this student jobs grant, looking at internship grants like the Career Launcher program. We're just hiring a digital marketing coordinator through that program, which is offering a wage subsidy, looking at volunteer positions. You can join committees, volunteer. We have youth that have taken programs from Minerva and volunteered for Minerva to help with their social media. It's been fun for them. They've gained some workplace skills. They get a reference from us, and they've been able to sort of get some exposure in the work world. So again, you have to evaluate at this joint of your career, like, can you take unpaid work or not? But unpaid can often be a way to get to know a charity, get to know their team, and embed yourself in and get some experience. And often with nonprofits, a volunteer that works out can turn into a longer term. Nonprofits with their budgeting and their finances, it can be a tricky thing. So with me and hiring a student intern, my hope is after 6 months of wage subsidy, I'll be able to have the budget to carry her forward. So it's sort of the entry point and the foot in the door in. So I think looking at opportunities to volunteer to get to know, that's how you can get to know a charity and see, is that one I want to work with? But Charity Village has lots of job postings, and I'm seeing more of a trend where charities and nonprofits are not just posting kind of what the role is, but also a bit more context about what the wages are, so that you can decide, can I afford this or not? Does this make sense for me?
Right, because I think it was an important message that you sent, Tina, that nonprofits don't equal no money. And don't equal necessarily low wages, or or even if the wages are a bit lower than some. I sometimes think that these are artificial benchmarks, but where you have other things is what a nonprofit can often offer you, recognizing it's maybe a little lower than you're used to, but here are all of the benefits that we can provide, and the flexibility and adaptability, but also this whole notion of giving back, which is important these days. People want a sense of community and giving back to their communities, or a cause, if you will, that is near and dear. And what better way to do that? So for those of you that are asking about how to find work, Charity Village is a great resource, and I think they have other articles and stuff too. So they're more than just the job board. And then volunteering is always a great way to get started in any sector, I would think. So let's see what else. They're coming in fast and furious. So one person is kind of curious. So how do nonprofits actually? Where does their money come from?
So it's a very good question. So charities and nonprofits, as I mentioned, are a bit different because of charities are able to give tax receipts. So you have to apply to become a charity, you have to get a charitable number, and you have to be doing work that is considered charitable. So that's things like alleviating poverty, advancing education, advancing religion is actually something that can be charitable, and or anything else that is doomed to have a benefit to the community. But you have to put that forward and say, this is a benefit. Anyone can start a nonprofit. A nonprofit can generate funds, but can't give tax receipts. So it's a little bit different when you're soliciting donations. So Minerva, if I think about us, our primary sources of revenue are individual donors, corporate donors. So many corporations have a social giving, social impact, community type of policy where they recognize that some of their, Some of their gains should be invested back into communities, and so many of them have community giving programs, community partnership programs that either is donation or sponsorship, where they're looking to partner with charities and nonprofits in ways that align with their goals and mission and sort of what they're portraying in the world. So we work a lot with corporations to solicit donations. We attract them into our youth leadership program. That's youth is a big pillar that's of interest. And then sponsoring certain events. We also work with foundations, so we write grants. We write grant proposals and applications to both foundations and government, applying for funds that they have. And often with government and foundations, they again have pillars or areas of interest, areas of concern that they are especially interested in funding. So you have to align your mission with what they are trying to accomplish. The worst thing you can do is try to apply for funding and then make your services fit what the person wants to fund, because that's always a losing game. You have to really have lots of meetings, relationship building. Minerva has a professional fundraiser on our staff. So she's done education. She's got a master's in philanthropy and giving. So a very professional type career where she has learned how do you set a strategy? How do you build relationships? How do you create a plan for raising the revenue you need to. And it's always a blend of raising in advance and raising in the moment, because usually, so Minerva came into this year about 60% funded, and then 40% was going to be through events that we hosted and things that we were doing this year. So it's kind of a mix of, mostly what you've got, and then are still fundraising throughout the year to achieve. But it's a variety, and some nonprofits and charities also have earned revenue. So they're selling things. They might have, so Minerva, for example, has a tuition-based program. Other charities and nonprofits may have other ways that they raise revenue by selling goods, services, and products to generate money. So We Charity would have been a really great example of that. We know that there's a big story there. That's a whole other Ask an Expert. But We Charity had a for-profit arm where they had different things that they could get people to buy, and then that money was intended to go back to support the charitable activities.
Right. So on that note, it came up for me with, going into the most bizarre year I think any of us will ever have in our lives potentially, and going into that 40% unfunded. One of our attendees has asked, how is the nonprofit sector changing during this time of a global pandemic, and how can we market ourselves to meet these new needs?
It's a great question.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of advocacy happening. So what's quite interesting is our sector doesn't have anyone in government advocating for us. So there is no arm of government that is responsible for charities and nonprofits. Like you might have someone who's advocating sort of for certain types of industry or the post-secondary education. So we're kind of a large part of the economy without a lot of security. And there's a projection right now that about 20% of charities and nonprofits will fail because of COVID,
Really?
and because of loss of donations. Yeah, it's quite significant. I mean, it's no different than a lot of the businesses, right? If we know what's happening, people have less to give. There's very high priority areas that are taking sort of the attention and sort of where funding is going. And most nonprofits and charities don't have a lot in the bank. So there are some criteria around not being able to have surpluses and sort of have, we've all got a rainy day fund to an extent, but how long you have and how much you have is very variable depending on the size of your organization and the type of funding you've had and what you've had available to you. So there's a lot of small nonprofits that are teeny tiny operations, no different than a small business, that are really at risk. So there's a lot of advocacy happening. So if you think about changes, there's advocacy happening. There's a lot of communication happening between organizations. I think we'll see some mergers potentially. And I think we'll also see some digitization and some modernization. So again, what COVID has done for everyone is force us to think differently about our services. And those of us who maybe were more face-to-face based are looking at, well, how do we now modernize and use digital technology to get our services out in a safe and effective way, which sometimes creates new opportunities. But yeah, it's a sector that will be hit hard, not unlike a lot of other sectors.
Yeah, and I hadn't really thought about how nobody is really paying attention. You hear lots about healthcare or education or tourism or food service, and yet there could be nonprofits or charities that exist in all of those things. But as an overall group, you really are kind of on your own. That's quite sad. Do you know, Tina, is there a similar organization to Minerva in Ontario?
The people doing work kind of in this field in Ontario that I know of, so Rotman School of Management has sort of a division called Gender in the Economy. And so Rotman does have some programming for girls and women, not anything that I've seen for high school girls. And what else is there? Girls 20 is in Ontario, and they are supporting young women's leadership, kind of more linked to sort of the G20 and more of a governmental influence, and also girls on boards. And then who else can I think of? Those are the couple that really come to mind. But there isn't anything exactly like us, but certainly organizations doing very good work along gender equality, racial equality, and then LGBTQ2S.
I think you might have spoken to this in your opening, but how big literally can a nonprofit organization be? Is there limits? Is there?
I don't think there are limits. I think the biggest, if you want to look, you could look at your local hospital foundations, and you can look at your local university or foundations, because they are generating money for sort of the healthcare and the nonprofit. And so this is interesting, right? If you think about the nonprofit and charitable sector, we're sort of filling in gaps. And sometimes it's gaps that people see, like, I love cats, and I can see that orange cats are, sort of disadvantaged in this way. So I'm going to start my own nonprofit to support orange cats. Like, there's definitely a degree of personal interest on an issue that is very small, and maybe tailored and unique to a small group of people. And then you see big issues that affect all of us. If you think about cancer, and we think about autism, we think about some of these far-reaching things where government doesn't quite have all the services, and the social sector is really filling in those gaps, right? And we see that in education, we see that in healthcare, and then we see it in societal kind of problems that aren't really being handled. And that's where we're playing our role. And so if you think about what I see as opportunity for the nonprofit sector is to really partner differently and be seen as a partner with government and business in the same way, because we are playing a significant role in providing services and supports that are, if we weren't there, would otherwise sort of be left open and people falling through the cracks more so than even they are now. So how do we partner and ensure that our priorities match those priorities of the other players, so that we can actually work together to be more efficient in all of that? So I think there's lots of room for growth and innovation. There's some good work being done at a Senate level in Canada to try and push that. Right,
great. Well, as always happens to us every Friday, we've run out of time. And we still have questions. So thank you, Tina. Thank you so much. For those of you that have asked where you can see this webinar, again, remember we're live streaming to YouTube. I never ever thought those words would be coming out of my mouth every Friday. So if you go to YouTube and search for Yorkville University, subscribe to our channel, all of our Ask an Expert sessions are there. You can watch us over and over and over again if you choose. Tina, this has been absolutely fantastic. Oh, there's some great information on the slide. And I certainly recommend Charity Village as well. I cannot thank you enough for coming and talking to our students today in our community and really, I think, really giving a strong plug, if I can use that term, for the important work and the incredible opportunity that is available in nonprofit organizations and in charities. And I think it's, especially as we start to rethink what life is going to look like, I think a lot of us are thinking about how do we do things differently, and maybe a nonprofit or a charity should be, I would certainly say, should be on all of our students' radar. Like, why not? It's incredible work, and it doesn't mean that you aren't paid, right?
Yeah. And I think just think of it as like any other organization. Just like, it's not necessarily like, oh, I have to be committed to that sector. I worked for for-profit, I work for nonprofit. I don't think it would be unlikely that I might switch back and work for a for-profit again, but it's thinking about, what do I care about? What problems do I want to solve? And which organizations are solving that? You might look a little bit beyond the sectors that by looking at nonprofit and being quite surprised at the innovation and cool companies or organizations that are doing good work.
Absolutely, absolutely. Tina, thank you so much. I can't thank you enough. It's been so great to see you.
You too.
So it's been fantastic. So everyone, we are done for our Ask an Expert. Just really quick, join us next week. We'll be back, and we're going to hear from Jody Kennett, who's going to discuss personal leadership to thrive through times of uncertainty, which is also pretty timely. So enjoy your day. Have a great weekend. Tina, thanks again.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.